Everything here spoke perfect solitude. A few goats and rabbits bounded across the plain. The barren region of the peak was 9 square leagues, and as the lower regions viewed from this point retrograded into the distance, the island appeared an immense heap of tortified matter, hemmed round by a scanty border of vegetation. From the Llano del Ratama they passed, through narrow defiles and small ravines hollowed at every remote time by the torrents, first arriving at a more elevated plain. Then at the place where they intended to pass the night, this station bore the name of the English halt. 2 inclined rocks formed a kind of caravan, which afforded shelter from the rains. Though in the midst of summer and under an African sky, they suffered from cold during the night. The thermometer descended there as low to 41 degrees. Their guides made up a large fire with the dry branches of retama. Having neither tents nor cloaks, Humboldt and Bonpland lay down on some masses of rock and were encumbered by the flame and smoke, which the wind drove towards them. They had attempted to form some kind of screen with cloths tied together, but their enclosure took fire, which they did not perceive till the greater part had been consumed by flames. As the temperature diminished, the peak became covered with thick clouds. The approach of night interrupted the play of the ascending current, which during the day rose from the plains during the high regions of the atmosphere, and the air in cooling lost its capacity of suspending water. A strong northerly wind chased the clouds. The moon, at the intervals shooting through the vapors, exposed its disk on the firmament of the darkest blue, and the view of the volcano threw a majestic character over the nocturnal scenery. Sometimes the peak was entirely hidden from their eyes by the fog, and other times it broke upon them in terrific proximity, and like an enormous pyramid threw its shadow over the clouds rolling beneath their feet. About 3 in the morning, by the sombrous light of a few fir torches, they started on their journey to the summit of the Sugarloaf. They scaled the volcano on the northeast side, where the declivities were extremely steep, and after 2 hours' toil reached a small plain, which, on account of its elevated position, bore the name of Alta Vista. This was the station of Neveros, the natives whose occupation it was to collect ice and snow, which they sold in the neighboring towns. Their mules better practiced in climbing mountains than those hired by travelers to reach Alta Vista, and the Neveros were obliged to transport the snow to that place on their backs. Above this point commenced the Malplays, a term by which is designated here as well as in every other country subject to volcanoes, grounds destitute of vegetable mold and covered with fragments of lava. Day was beginning to dawn with the travelers left by the ice cavern. They observed during the twilight a phenomenon which is not unusual on high mountains, but which the position of the volcano they were scaling rendered it very striking. A layer of white and fleecy clouds concealed from them the sight of the ocean and the lower region of the island. This layer did not appear above 5,000 feet. The clouds were so uniformly spread and kept so perfect a level that they wore the appearance of a vast plain covered with snow. The colossal pyramid of the peak, the volcanic summits of Lancerota and of Fort Aventura, and the Isle of Palma were like rocks amidst the vast sea of vapors, and their black tints were in fine contrast with the whiteness of the clouds. While they were climbing over the broken lavas of the Malpays, they perceived a very curious optical phenomenon which lasted some minutes. They thought they saw on the east side small rockets thrown into the air. Luminous points about 7 or 8 degrees above the horizon appeared first to move in a vertical direction, but their motion was gradually changed into horizontal oscillation. Their fellow travelers, their guides even, were astonished at this phenomenon, without either Humboldt or Bonpland having made any remark on it to them. The travelers thought at first sight that these luminous points which floated in the air indicated some new eruption of the great volcano of Lancerota, for they recollected that Boger and Lacanamandine, in scaling the volcano of Pinchincha, were witnesses of the eruption of Cotopaxi, and the illusion soon ceased, and they found that the luminous points were the images of several stars magnified by the vapors. These images remained motionless at intervals. They then seemed to rise perpendicularly, descended sideways, and returned to the point where they had departed. This motion lasted 1 or 2 seconds. Though they had no exact means of measuring the exact extent of the lateral shifting, they did not less distinctly observe the path of the luminous point. It did not appear double from an effect of mirage, and left no trace of light behind. Bringing with the telescope of a small sextant the stars into contact with the lofty summit of a mountain in Lancerota, Humboldt observed that the oscillation was constantly directed towards the same point, which was towards the part of the horizon where the disk of the sun was to appear, and that making allowance for the motion of the stars and its declination, the image returned always to the same place. These appearances of lateral refraction ceased long before the daylight rendered the stars quite invisible. The road which they were obliged to clear themselves across the Malpays was extremely fatiguing. The ascent was steep, and the blocks of lava rolled from beneath their feet. At the peak, the lava broken into sharp pieces left hollows in which they risked falling up to their waist. Unfortunately, the listlessness of their guides contributed to increase the difficulty of this ascent. Models of the phlegmatic, they had wished to persuade Humboldt and Bonpland on the preceding evening not to go beyond the station of the rocks. Every 10 minutes they sat down to rest themselves, and when unobserved they threw away the specimens of obsidian and pumice stone which the geologists had carefully collected. They discovered at length that none of the guides had ever visited the summit of the volcano. After 3 hours walking, they reached at the extremity of the Malpays a small plain called La Rambleta, from the center of which the Sugarloaf took its rise. They had yet to scale the steepest part of the mountain, the Sugarloaf, which formed the summit. The slope of the small cone, covered with volcanic ashes and fragments of the pumice stone, was so steep that it would not have been impossible to reach the top, had they not ascended by an old current of lava, the debris of which resisted the ravages of time. These debris formed a wall of scorious rocks which stretched into the midst of the loose ashes. They ascended the Sugarloaf by grasping the half-decomposed scoria, which often broke in their hands. They employed nearly half an hour to scale a hill, the perpendicular height of which was scarcely 540 feet. When they gained the summit of the Sugarloaf, they were surprised to find scarcely room enough to seat themselves conveniently. They were stopped by a small circular wall of polyphyretic lava, and a base of pitch stone, which concealed from the view of the crater. The west wind blew with such violence that they could scarcely stand. It was 8 in the morning, and they had suffered severely from the cold, though the thermometer kept a little above the freezing point. The wall which surrounded the crater like a parapet was so high that it would have been impossible to reach the crater itself, if on the eastern side there had not been a breach which seemed to have been the effect of a flowing of very old lava. They descended through this breach toward the bottom of the funnel, the figure of which was elliptic. The greatest breadth of the mouth appeared to them to be 300 feet, the smallest 200 feet. The external edges of the crater were almost perpendicular. They ascended from the bottom of the crater on a train of broken lava from the eastern breach of the enclosure. The heat was also perceptible only in a few orifices, which gave vent to aqueous vapors with a peculiar buzzing noise. Some of these funnels of crevices were on the outside of the enclosure on the external brink of the parapet that surrounded the crater. Humboldt plunged the thermometer into them and saw it rapidly rise to 154-167 degrees, and also sketched on the spot a view of the interior edge of the crater as it presented itself to the descent of the eastern track. The top of the circular wall exhibited those curious ramifications which were found in coke. With the northern edge was most elevated towards the southwest, the enclosures were considerably sunk, and an enormous mass of scorious lava seemed glued to the extremity of the brink. The rock was perforated on the west, and a large opening gave a view to the horizon of the sea. Seated on the brink of the crater, Humboldt dug a hole some inches deep, into which he placed the thermometer, which rapidly rose to 107 degrees. Some sulfurous crystals which he had gathered here consumed the paper in which he wrapped them, and a part of his mineralogical journal besides. From the outer edge of the crater, which, admiring the travelers, turned their eyes toward the southeast, the coasts were studded with villages and hamlets. At their feet were masses of vapor constantly driven by the winds. A uniform stratum of clouds had been pierced in several places by the effect of small currents in air, which the earth, heated by the sun, began to send towards them. The port of Otova, its vessels at anchor, the gardens and the vineyards encircling the town, which showed themselves through an opening which seemed to enlarge every instant. From the summit of these solitary regions, their eyes wandered over an inhabited world. They enjoyed the striking contrast beside the bare side peaks, its steep declivities covered with scoria, its elevated plains destitute of vegetation, and the smiling aspect of the cultured country beneath. They beheld the plants divided by zones as the temperature of the atmosphere diminished with the elevation. Below the sugarloaf, lichens began to cover the scorious and lustrous lava, and violets rose on the slope of the volcano at 8,500 feet of height. Tufts of red tama, loaded with flowers, adorned the valleys hollowed out by the torrents, and encumbered with the effects of the lateral eruptions. Below the retama lay the region of ferns, bordered by the tract of the arborescent heaths. Forests of laurel and rahumis and arbutus divided the arencas from the rising grounds planted with vines and fruit flowers. A rich carpet of verdure extended from the plain of Spartium and the zone of alpine plants gave to the groups of date trees in the Musa, at the feet of which the ocean appeared to roll. These seeming proximity in which from the summit of the peak they beheld the hamlets, the vineyards, and the garden of the coast, was increased by the prodigious transparency of the atmosphere. In spite of the great distance, they could plainly distinguish not only the houses, the sails of the vessel, and the trunks of the trees. They could not just discern the vivid coloring of the vegetation of the plains. Notwithstanding the heat which they coated their feet on the edge of the crater, the cone of ashes remains covered with snow during several months in winter. It was probable that under the cap of snow considerable hollows were found, like those existing under the glaciers of Switzerland, the temperature of which was constantly less elevated than that of the soil which they reposed. The cold and violent winds which blew from the time of sunrise and induced them to seek shelter at the foot of the sugar loaf. Their hands and faces were nearly frozen, while their boots were burnt by the soil on which they walked. They descended in the space of a few minutes to the sugar loaf which they had scaled with so much toil. With this rapidity was in part involuntary, for they often rolled down on the ashes. It was with great regret that they quitted this solitude, this domain where nature reigned in all her majesty. They traversed the Malpays but slowly, for their feet found no sure foundation on the loose blocks of lava. Near the station of the rocks, the descent became extremely difficult. The compact, short swarded turf was so slippery that they were obliged to incline their bodies continually backward in order to avoid falling. In the sandy plain of Ratama, the thermometer rose to 72 degrees, and this heat seemed to them suffocating in comparison with the cold which they had suffered from the air on the summit of the volcano. They were absolutely without water, for their guides, not satisfied with drinking clandestinely, had their little supply of Malmsey wine, had broken their water jars. They at length enjoyed the refreshing breeze in the beautiful region of the effervescent erica and fern. They were enveloped in a thick bed of clouds stationary at 3,600 feet above the plain. The clouds having dispersed, they remained on a phenomenon which afterwards became familiar to them on the declivities of the Cordilleras. Small currents of air chased clouds with unequal velocity and in opposite directions. They bore the appearance of streamlets of water in rapid motion, and following in all directions amidst a great mass of stagnant water. As the travelers approached the town of Orotava, they were met with great flocks of canaries. These birds, well known in Europe and America, were in general uniformly green. Some, however, had a yellow tinge on their backs. Their note was the same as that of the tame canary. Towards the close of the day, they reached the port of Otova, where they received the unexpected intelligence that Pizarro would not set sail till the 24th or 25th. If they could have calculated on this delay, they may have lengthened their stay on the peak, or have made an excursion to the volcano of Chahora. As it was, they passed the following day in visiting the visions of Ortova, and enjoying its agreeable society. They were present on the eve of St. John at a pastoral fete. In the beginning of the evening, the slope of the volcano exhibited a sudden and most extraordinary spectacle. The shepherds, in conformity to a custom no doubt introduced by the Spaniards, had lighted the fires of St. John. The scattered masses of fire and the columns of smoke driven by the wind formed a fine contrast with the deep verdure of the forest which covered the sides of the peak. Shouts of joy resounding from afar, they were the only sounds that broke the silence of nature in the solitary regions. They left the road of Santa Cruz on the 25th of June and directed their course towards South America. They soon lost sight of the Canary Islands, the lofty mountains of which were covered with a reddish vapor. The peak alone appeared from time to time, as at intervals the wind dispersed the clouds that enveloped the sugar loaf. A few land birds, which had been driven to sea by the impetuosity of the wind, followed them for several days. The wind fell gradually. The farther they receded from the African coast, it was sometimes smooth water for several hours, and these short calms were regularly interrupted by electrical phenomena. Black, thick clouds marked by strong outlines rose on the east, and it seemed as if a squall would have forced the Pizarro to hand her topsails, but the breeze freshened anew. There fell a few large drops of rain, and the storm disappeared without hearing any thunder.